Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. You know, space is expensive. It will require enormous investments, total adaptability, innovation, and experimentation, and behavioral changes, the likes of which the engineering community and human ingenuity have never seen. How's it going to get done? Well, we say collaboration, but that's kind of like saying ants do better together than on their own. What will be the financial structures and the technology partnerships and the regulatory framework that gets us there? In previous episodes, we spoke with folks like Voyager Holdings' Dylan Taylor. His Space for Humanity project, for example, is among those actively figuring out what the economics of creating some space for space looks like. Well, we're going to keep going up the path, not down the path, here at the Better Satellite World, with a new series later in the year about public-private partnerships. So to tee that up for us, we invited Brittany Zimmerman here to kind of help us think it through. We'll be opening an online survey form for you to add your thoughts and ideas as well. Now, as the principal investigator and aerospace engineer at Paragon Space Development, Brittany received one of 3 Industry Promise Awards in 2020. She's become the CEO and Chief of Innovation at Yummet, a venture dedicated to bioregenerative, physiochemical, and hybrid life support systems. And we're delighted to have her. The Better Satellite World podcast and this conversation is supported by the corporate partners of SSPI, EchoStar Hughes, and Access Intelligence. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of SSPI and its chapters around the world. Thank you, SSPI. Brittany Zimmerman, welcome.
Thank you, Lou. Happy to be here.
Well, it's good to hear your voice. Well, let's talk about this. This is the big subject we're going to tackle this year. Let's talk about the challenge of getting to space with the current financial and regulatory structures we have. Now, I'm going to guess and say they're not quite appropriate, but that's answering the question for you. What do you say?
Yeah, right now, I think that we have seen a slight shift in what we are doing in the space sector in terms of our partnerships amongst the government, or I should say the public entities and the private sectors. So this is a topic I think is really interesting because I think we are in a new era of this investigation of how these PPPs, if I may, are being formed and looked at. I have had the pleasure of being a part of PPPs from the private sector side as a principal investigator and a negotiator of those contracts. And it's been a fun adventure to watch how that has changed over the last few years. I already see some major migration in the way that RFIs or requests for information are coming out of the government sector specific to future PPPs. So Lou, I think this is as perfect time as ever to start laying some groundwork on what those could look like, what some of the current obstacles are, how to overcome those, how to pull in additional players, and just, provide that framework.
Yeah. And, timing is everything, right? And so, I'm glad we're getting to this. What has been the more significant changes that you've observed as you've been investigating this?
So I have seen a really interesting shift in the last couple of years. I think, as you guys know, there is typically a lot of red tape, if I may.
Yeah, we all know what that is.
Yeah, in the way that a lot of these contracts are written, specifically from the government side in their RFPs and their partnering styles. In the current RFIs that are going out, there's a lot more wiggle room, right? And I wouldn't say that that's been built into the contracts yet, but at least the government is asking the questions, right? How can we play better with the private sector? If we're going to build up a US Space Force or additional PPPs, either at the USG side of things, on the DoD side of things, how can we, in this period of formation, build things to be a better partner, to leverage the capabilities of the private sector as we're moving forward in order to not be redundant? And those are such important questions to see on those RFIs that I know, sitting on the private side of things, I'm very, very happy to see included in the thought process.
Brittany, is it because they being the government, recognizes that, as I said at the outset, this is such an enormous undertaking and such a new endeavor that they're willing to say there's things we don't know, but we know that the private sector, the commercial sector, may have a solution, may have gotten there ahead of us, and so we're willing to do something we don't typically do when we put out an RFI.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've seen some rather groundbreaking private space companies that have afforded us that luxury, so to speak. There is no doubt an advantage to leveraging, right, our private side of this industry, because there isn't a lot of these same obstacles or red tape that we need to overcome on the private side of things. And there is a beautiful symbiosis that exists in the partnering of the public and the private companies. And I don't know if we can call it a public company, but you know what I mean.
Sure.
An organization.
Yeah.
And I love the way that this is coming about, because I see the realization that there are private companies that can achieve these milestones in a cheaper fashion, right? And as long as there is some sort of an ROI or an economic advantage for a private company to be exercising this portion of the space industry, there's no reason that the government sector can't focus their efforts on the riskier, right, or higher ticket dollar parts of a space mission. So this cooperative path forward, I see as nearly one of the only options if we want to keep things almost domestic, I should say.
Yeah, it's interesting. The current public-private partnerships, have a certain role, a certain function. We see them operate differently in different countries.
Yes.
And my question is, based on some experience I've had, how much of the public-private partnership is just having someone to bring the two parties together? And I asked that question because I remember one time being down in Arlington County, Virginia, where you've got the Pentagon, you've got the intelligence agencies, you've got a lot of new startup activity and so forth. And the Economic Development Agency down there figured out that the reason they're not talking to one another, even though they say that the government said they wanted to reach out more deeply into the private sector, was because there was no mechanism. There was nothing, there was no one to bring them together, no convener, no one to throw the party, no one to buy the champagne, so to speak. So we've got, we've got public-private partnerships, we've got the concept, but how should they be looked at now? And who is going to do the convening? Who should be doing the convening, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lou. And I think the way that we see it right now, it is more or less led by the government sector, right? They're putting out specific calls or solicitations that are being answered. And that is the mechanism by which these, answers to the roadmap on the government side of things is really what's driving this collaboration. And it's relatively competitive right now, which I think is great, in the sense that these solicitations come out, these needs for specific partners to play specific roles. The thing that I think really needs to be worked on too is that sometimes the government sector doesn't see future growth in the same way that the private sector does, right? So they might be missing some large gaps that exist in their technical roadmap. So we might have technology that's being developed, or big companies on the private sector developing these technologies without a call specific to what they're, engineering or developing. And if you know the right people in the way that things are set up today, there are avenues for having conversations about what your company on the private sector can do. And that kind of opens the eyes of the people who write a lot of those solicitations or calls, and you'll see those get worked into future solicitations. What we need is a better mechanism to understand what is all available, and then do a good job at pulling those, those needs and those capabilities together. It's almost like a matchmaking service.
Right. Yeah, when you say mechanism, I mean, that's again using a word to say, who is the convener? Is it a platform? Is it an organization like ours, or some government agency that needs to get created, or does the private sector put together an association? Do you have any thoughts on that, or have you seen a best practice that you might say, I think this can export and scale as we move further and further into this?
Right, and I think that the government has had the lead on this for quite a while. I can see that remaining in the sense that there becomes an avenue where a lot of that feedback is looped into the system, right? Where we see an avenue for communicating what those major technology development areas are, and how they could really feed into what the government is doing in the future. We need to be cognizant, of course, that there's going to be parts of the private industry that are developing that may not necessarily be conducive to the long-term goals of the government.
Right.
So I'm not saying that everything needs to fit into a PPP, but there are a lot of places, especially on the R&D side of things, where there can be collaboration that helps us buy down the risks on the government side of things, and allows us to, provide ROIs on the private side of things. In terms of whether or not that the role of the matchmaker there should shift, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to have the commercial sector lead government direction. So I can't see that ever being fully adopted or useful. But having a matchmaking middleman, I could see that happening, or allowing, that scalability platform to exist in order for these matches to occur, as being a wonderful path forward.
Yeah. As this again evolves, when we think about, science fiction shows and stuff, what often happens, at least in my viewing of these things, is that the government's role kind of morphs, it shifts. And the private sector's role kind of shifts. They become this sort of different kind of entity. Now, historically, government has been, responsible for domestic security, the public welfare. It's an enabling body of the people that allows the private sector, those of you and I in the private sector, to create wealth, which we consider to be a very, very good thing in our structure, in our society, in our capitalist society. I think it's a great thing. Is there going to be sort of a shift? Is space going to shift that? Is it going to make government different, change the role of government at all?
Well, from where I sit, there's a very small overlap in where the handoff occurs between, right, the government direction and private execution. And the government does and should, I believe, take the lead in places where a long-term and expensive goal that may or may not provide an ROI is necessary, right, for the civilization and certainly for the nation.
Right.
And we have seen that when that avenue becomes profitable to some degree, that sort of overlap of that Venn diagram occurs then. And at some point in time, in my viewpoint, the government should relinquish that to fair competition, right? There isn't a strong need for the government to be in that market any longer. In terms of space exploration, that's going to be for as long as our planet exists, probably, because there's so much to explore. But we need to just make sure that continues to progress, right? What I think we want to avoid is having the government stay in every single aspect of the space economy when we have the private sector happy to take the reins. So I think it's this, exactly what you said, Lou, this migration of what the government does, right, and what the private sector does, and that does adapt with time, and I think it should continue to adapt with time. So absolutely, I see this push of ours to explore further into the solar system as a catalyst to that adaptation, as I think every major step should.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, you said a few minutes back, Brittany, there are going to be certain endeavors or certain things that are best suited for these public-private partnerships, these new ones. You referred to R&D. Is that the area that you think, if we design this beta test, so to speak, will be the first area?
Yeah, absolutely, right? There's a lot of risk associated with technology development and even utilizing older technologies, but in new environments. And that's one of the things that's wonderful about partnering with the government, right? Is they're there to buy down some of that risk, but they're also there to benefit on the advancements of those technologies. So absolutely, I see R&D as a huge one. I also think every time we take a step a little bit further into the solar system, we have the government there with us to aid us, right? There might be places in the solar system or beyond where the step doesn't prove to be profitable, right? And maybe that's the realm where the government, almost takes full control, and there isn't really a room for the private sector to grow there because there isn't the economic benefit for them to be there. But there may be a scientific advantage for us in furthering our understanding and our knowledge of the cosmos. So there is a reason for us to be there as a people.
Right. Well, here's a question for you. It's going to be like a Zen koan probably for you. Who's responsible for determining the nature of existence or the origin of life? And I know I'm coming from left field. Everybody, yes, all of us.
Yeah, every human.
Good answer. Everybody who's alive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a question that intrigues, each person almost from birth. As soon as you start formulating your own thoughts, it's something that crosses our mind. So absolutely, I believe that's a philosophical question, and philosophy is something that, every human is responsible for.
Yeah, exactly. And it's going to be important. I mean, when we talk to Dylan and Frank White and some of these guys and gals, this is going to be an important question, because we're going to go to places that suspend the kinds of things that culturally we've come to believe as the nature of our existence or the origin of our existence. And all of a sudden we're going to need some kind of framework for dealing with the shock of that.
Absolutely. And we need to learn how to be adaptable and open-minded when we come across new information that might shape the way that we think about things. That's hard for us to do. We are inherently resistant to change to some degree.
Oh, listen, I've got a whole show on that I want to do.
Oh,
Exactly.
yeah.
Oh, yeah, we're going to go there. But I also want to go back to earth and ask a question that also intrigues me. And, as we get near the end here, I think it's also important that we look at public-private partnerships with respect to the degree to which our industry is now becoming of such a size and nature and scope that we're beginning to boost regional economies.
Oh, yeah.
We are beginning to see real impact in the economies and the social fabric of places
Absolutely.
that some of them were hard hit post-industrial age economies. And it's great to see that. So Brittany, how can public-private partnerships bring together the investment, remobilize post-industrial age workers, new entrants into the workforce, et cetera, create mini booms in hard hit places? Is there a role for public-private partnerships there in your view?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I've seen a little bit and been involved in a few things that sound just like what you're talking about. About a year and a half ago, I worked in a PPP where I represented the private portion of this relationship, but we also tied in universities. So we had a professor in a full department at a university who was part of this PPP, and then we had the U.S. government as the third entity there. And I was, and I was kind of mulling on this, and I thought, how there has to be a way to formulate a contract such that investors can also be kind of like the fourth pillar, right, of these types of contracts. There's got to be a way that can be worked. And, I guess my thought process or my train of thought there kind of led me to a way of utilizing the private company in a relationship with the investor to kind of to be responsible for the ROIs there, and then allowing the government sector to play the role that they've been playing, right?
Yeah.
So kind of folding the investor in more in terms of a relationship with the private company in that relationship, because I feel like that's kind of the fourth player that hasn't had such a great opportunity to kind of get into these PPPs, right?
Yes. No, that you're exactly right. And I've seen, through other work that I do, models. One in the Netherlands, they call it the Triple Helix, where I may have spoken about this on another show, but my audience will forgive me, where we've seen the Dutch, it was the Eindhoven region actually, they formed a public-private partnership made up of 23 communities, and they called it Brainport. And they worked together to create what they called the Triple Helix, which is exactly what you described: the academic sector, the private and investment class, and the local and regional and national governments. And they built a structure, a mechanism, as you say, to create a new type of economy there. And all of these players participated on a regular basis. And today, that region, if you look at the numbers, they outperform the entire Dutch economy by about 1 percentage point GDP, right? And it doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot, right?
That's huge. Yeah, no, that's awesome. And the lucky thing about this, Lou, too, is space in itself is such an inspiring, industry that we don't have to do any massive marketing campaigns, and we don't have to throw out any propaganda. It's not like mining or coding where we have to trick people into loving their work. Right. It's already and inherently part of like our inspiration and our interest and our intrigue as humans that we've completely lucked out in that sense. So as we've talked, we can pull people from all ages and all sectors because it's such a fascinating industry to work in. And we need people of all ages and from all sectors to really round out, this space. I love the space for all portion of this, right? Because really it is space for all. We need everything. And I think we're so lucky because I think it can provide exactly that regional boom that you're talking about, because I don't think it would take too much to convince like an electrical engineer who works on something else to come to the space industry, right? I feel like we have a really good grab at a lot of the best from multiple industries based on just the human curiosity and love for space.
Yeah, exactly. And if the economics work out, and of course it's inevitable that they will,
Yeah.
you will get the talent. And it goes back to that philosophical question, the origin of life. I mean, you look at the ocean, you feel differently. You feel something about your own origin. You look at space, it's the same thing. Those things are built in for. No marketing person could create something that great to attract someone's interest. Speaking of interest, last thing, you said that you wanted to do a survey. You wanted us to ask people what kind of programming they would like around this subject of public-private partnerships. You want to just speak briefly on that, and then we're going to end the show here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was thinking that we could kind of set up the next few conversations in a few different ways, right? One would be topic-based. So do we want to have conversations about, what we could do on a legislative level, right? Or a policy level to help PPPs and how we could form that. Or maybe we want to talk about this maybe from the US government / DoD side of things, like what can we do to remove some of those barriers to entry for private companies, or some of the, stipulations required or certifications that are needed, or massive review cycles that are required in conversation with some of the, the public side of the players here. Do we want to ask questions specific to the private sectors, right? Like, what are a lot of those obstacles? How do you see your companies being formed? Do you have a specific R&D portion that's meant to work with PPPs, or are you developing like commercial products and government products, or are those one and the same? There's a lot of questions we can ask from a lot of these different sectors. I would love the audience to provide a lot of the questions that they see popping up, and talking a little bit about the format. Do we want to sit down with each group one at a time and have those conversations with the big players in each of those? Or do we want to have topics that get brought up where we have representative from each of those sectors, and the academic side too, of course. We want to get people from the university side of things in here as well. So do we want to set this up? What questions do we want to ask? And do we want to have, a representative from each of those sectors in each of the conversations? Or do we want to focus each of our conversations between just policymakers and just the government side of things?
Right.
Just the public side of things.
Yeah. Questions to be asked, I think.
Yes.
We'll ask those questions maybe individually, and then we'll have, like a jam, bring all the musicians together as part of the big orchestra. Well, Brittany, that's great, and we'll put information up about where people can go to enter their ideas in addition to yours, and then we'll see what we come up with as we produce our programming for this. Now, listen, I really appreciate you starting us off here, and I think we'll really have something to discuss that is relevant to where we want to go as an industry and as a species.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time today, Lou.
Thanks, Brittany. Well, that wraps up our conversation with Brittany Zimmerman. Brittany, thanks again. We'd like to hear from you on your ideas for this series, as Brittany said. So for more information, you'll see how you can participate by looking at the details that we've posted below. SSPI is the voice of the space and satellite professional, a professional whose work makes the world better every single minute of the day. To learn more about the Better Satellite World campaign, go to bettersatelliteworld.com. If you are not a member of SSPI and would like to be, go to sspi.org. Annual dues are $100 US per year, but if you're a student, your membership is free. And follow us on Twitter at SSPI, and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world. Take care, everybody.